There is a particular kind of story that begins not with a choice, but with the absence of one, with a quill touching parchment at the wrong moment, with a name you didn't notice until it was already yours to keep. This is that story. The stack of parchment on Hermione Granger's desk had reached a height that she privately considered architectural. It leaned slightly to the left, held together by nothing more than a binder clip and the particular stubbornness of someone who had survived a war and was now, 6 months later, surviving the Ministry of Magic's post-war reconstruction filing system, which, if she were being honest, was the greater feat. It was 11:30 on a Thursday. The candle at her left elbow had burned down to a nub, throwing amber light across the cluttered surface of her temporary office. A converted storage room on the 4th floor that smelled of old ink and something faintly metallic, like copper coins left too long in a coat pocket. She had been given the room along with a title, Junior Consultant, Magical Law Reconstruction, and a mandate so broad it amounted to fix everything that's broken. She was trying. The parchment stack that evening contained, among other things, 3 petitions for the restoration of Muggle-born wand rights, a reparations filing from a Welsh family whose cottage had been destroyed in the spring offensives, 2 requests from Hogwarts for updated library permits, and a dense, poorly formatted document she had already read the first line of 3 times without absorbing it, because her tea had gone cold and the candle was guttering, and her eyes had begun to do that particular sliding thing they did after the 7th hour of reading. She signed it. She initialed the box at the bottom. She pressed her wand tip to the ministry seal, which flared blue, then gold, then went dark. She moved on. She did not read the title. She did not read the body. She did not notice the name printed in small, precise letters in the 3rd paragraph. The name she would have recognized immediately, would have stopped at, would have read and reread and carried to her supervisor and said in her firmest voice, absolutely not. Had she not been so terribly, exhaustingly tired? She went home at midnight. She slept without dreaming. The knock came 9 days later. She was at home on a Saturday morning, cross-legged on her sitting room floor with a cup of tea that was actually still warm, and a copy of Wizarding Law in Transition. A practitioner's guide open across her knees when someone knocked on her door with the particular cadence of a person who had rehearsed doing so. 3 firm, measured strikes, not urgent, not polite. She wasn't expecting anyone. She set down her tea, unfolded herself from the floor, and opened the door. The grey eyes were the first thing. She had not seen them in 6 months. Had not, if she were honest, expected to see them again outside of a courtroom. And they were exactly as she remembered, pale as January light through frosted glass, and doing that careful, watchful thing they always did, the thing that looked like boredom if you didn't know better. The face around them was thinner than she remembered, the jaw sharper. The hair, always so precisely arranged in school, was slightly less curated, pushed back rather than styled, as though he had stopped caring about the performance of it, or had simply run out of energy to keep it up. He was wearing a dark grey coat, muggle cut, buttoned to the throat. His hands were in his pockets. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Granger," said Draco Malfoy. The single word carried the tone of someone reporting for a medical procedure they found both undignified and inevitable. "Malfoy," she said, because her brain had briefly vacated the premises and left only her mouth in charge. "I've been informed," he said, "that you are, as of 9 days ago, my legal magical guardian." He paused. Something moved in the region of his jaw, a tightening quickly suppressed. "I wanted to give you time to discover this on your own. In the apparent absence of that discovery, I've come to inform you myself." The silence that followed had a texture, something between the charged stillness before a hex and the horrible suspended moment after a sentence lands, but before its meaning fully does. "I'm sorry," Hermione said. "You're my what?" "Guardian." He said the word as though it had personally offended him. "Legal, magical, mine, you." Another pause. "I'm told you signed the form." "I signed dozens of forms." "Yes," he said. "I'm aware that you didn't read this one." The heat that moved up her neck was not embarrassment, or at least she told herself firmly that it wasn't. It was something more like the sensation of stepping onto a staircase that wasn't there, that hollow lurch of miscalculation. She, Hermione Granger, who had proofread her own Hogwarts registration forms at age 11. She, who had once made Ron reread a permission slip 3 times before signing. She, who had built her entire professional credibility on the premise that she did not sign things she hadn't read. "Come in," she said. He raised an eyebrow. It was a very slight movement, barely visible, but she had years of practice reading the subtle semaphore of Draco Malfoy's face. "I'd rather not," he said. "I'd rather you did," she said, "given that apparently I'm responsible for you, and I'd prefer not to have this conversation on my doorstep." A beat. He stepped inside. Her sitting room, in the grey morning light, was everything his was not. Warm colours, crowded bookshelves, a throw blanket in amber and rust draped over the back of the sofa, a half-empty mug on the floor beside a marked-up legal text. It was, he registered with some involuntary precision, the room of someone who lived in their own space rather than simply occupying it. He stood near the door. He did not remove his coat. She went to the kitchen without asking and came back with a second cup of tea, which he set on the small table near the sofa with a deliberateness that he recognized as her version of collecting herself. She sat. She did not gesture for him to sit. He sat, anyway, in the chair nearest the window, because standing felt theatrical, and he had decided in the weeks since his solicitor had delivered this particular piece of news that he was going to handle this without theatrics. He watched her pick up the tea, set it down, pick it up again. "Tell me exactly what the form says," she said. "You should read it yourself." "I'm asking you." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded sheet of parchment. Ministry letterhead, official seal, his own name in that third paragraph like a sentence he hadn't finished serving, and held it out. She took it. He watched her read. He had watched her read before, years ago in classrooms and libraries, and she had the same quality now that she'd had then. A total, almost physical absorption, the kind of attention that made the rest of her go very still. Her eyes moved quickly. Her left hand came up and pressed briefly against the side of her neck, just below the jaw, a gesture so small he nearly missed it. She read the whole document. Then she read the third paragraph again. "This is," she said carefully, "a wartime emergency provision." "Yes." It was designed for Death Eaters deemed too high risk for standard probation, but not convicted of crimes warranting imprisonment. The Guardian acts as a... She scanned the page. A legal co-signatory and character surety. Beautifully summarized. You cannot leave Britain without my written approval. She looked up. You cannot enter into contracts valued over 200 galleons. You cannot... She turned the page. Make certain acquisitions, including property and... A pause. Wands. I still have my wand, he said. The restriction applies to purchasing a new one. A very small silence. How are you managing financially? The question landed differently than she'd intended. She could see that in the fractional shift of his expression, a tightening around the eyes. Not anger exactly, but something in the same family. My assets have been frozen pending the estate review, he said, in the tone of someone reading from a document they have memorized in order to get through it. I have a monthly ministry stipend. It's sufficient. She nodded slowly. She set the parchment down. She straightened it unnecessarily, aligning its edges with the edge of the table with the focused care of someone who needed her hands to have something small and manageable to do. I'm going to fix this, she said. Fix it. He repeated the phrase with a flatness that was not quite mockery. This was clearly an administrative error. I didn't understand what I was signing. I'll file a petition for reassignment. You can't. She looked up. I've had my solicitor review this. There was something in his voice now. Not smugness, she realized, but something older and more tired than smugness. The guardianship, once assigned and sealed, cannot be reassigned for a minimum of 1 year unless the guardian commits a violation of the charter or the ward. A barely perceptible pause at the word. Petitions for dissolution on grounds of mistreatment or abandonment. You could petition. I'm not going to do that. Why not? He looked at her. The grey eyes were very steady. Outside, somewhere in the street below, a bicycle wheel made a thin metallic sound against wet pavement, and then was gone. Because, he said, it would require me to claim abandonment or mistreatment at the hands of Hermione Granger, and whatever satisfaction that might offer in theory, the practical reality is that no one in the ministry would believe it, and I would look. He stopped. His jaw moved. Ridiculous, he said at last. She almost said, you're worried about looking ridiculous, but caught it in time. Something about the way he'd paused before that word, the almost imperceptible inventory of better words he'd audited and rejected, made her hold her tongue. So, we're stuck, she said instead. For a year, he agreed. She stood up. She went to the window and stood with her back to him, looking down at the street. Wet cobblestones, the pale blur of a morning fog that hadn't quite decided to lift. A cat sitting very deliberately on a low garden wall as though it were conducting a survey. A year. She was responsible for Draco Malfoy for 1 year. She tried to locate somewhere in her chest the appropriate emotional response to this information. What she found instead was something stranger. Not fury, not despair, but a peculiar, almost detached clarity, like the moment after a large and unexpected problem has been fully identified, and the mind stops panicking and starts, almost involuntarily, to organize. She turned back. Then we need terms, she said. He had been watching her the entire time. She felt, rather than saw, the particular quality of his attention, the way it tracked her not like an opponent measures distance, but like someone trying to read weather. "Terms," he said. "Rules. A structure. This doesn't have to be..." She searched for a word. "Chaotic." Something moved across his face then, something so brief she couldn't catalogue it. He looked down at his hands. He had taken them out of his pockets while she wasn't watching. They were resting on his knees now, very still. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it does." She nodded. She picked up her tea. It had gone cold while they spoke, and she drank it anyway, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched in the quiet room like something pulled slowly, carefully, to see how much give it had before it changed shape entirely. "Same time next week," she said finally. "We'll go over the ministry requirements together. I'll have read everything by then." He stood. He straightened his coat, a careful, habitual motion that had nothing to do with the coat being crooked. He moved toward the door. "Granger," he said, with his hand on the handle. "Yes?" He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her, fixing his gaze somewhere in the middle distance between her face and the wall of books behind her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't request you specifically." It took her a moment to understand why he'd said it, and then it did. He wasn't apologizing. He was, in his sideways, armored fashion, telling her that this wasn't a game he'd arranged, that he was not here by design. "I know," she said. He left. She stood in the quiet of her sitting room for a long moment after the door closed, her cold tea in her hand, her legal guide still open on the floor, the grey morning pressing softly against the glass. Then she went to find the document. She was going to read it, all of it, every last word. And somewhere between the second subclause and the official ministry watermark, she found the line she had missed 9 days ago, the line that changed the particular flavour of everything. The guardian and ward are further required under Section 7(b) of the Emergency Magical Surety Act to maintain regular and documented contact no less than once per week for the duration of the guardianship period. Failure to comply will result in automatic escalation to the Department of Magical Enforcement. Weekly contact, documented, for a year. She set the parchment down. Outside, the fog had made up its mind. It was raining. The terms, as Hermione drafted them on Sunday morning, covered 1.5 pages of narrow-ruled parchment in her smallest handwriting. She had been awake since 6. Not because of anxiety, she told herself this firmly, twice, but because she was a person who, when presented with an unresolved structural problem, found sleep a somewhat theoretical concept until the structure had been addressed. The problem was clear. The solution required documentation. Documentation required a desk, a quill, and the particular quality of early morning silence that felt less like emptiness and more like uninterrupted space. She wrote the terms. Weekly meetings, Tuesdays, 7 o'clock. Location, Granger's residence, unless ministry check-ins require alternative arrangements. All ministry-required documentation to be handled jointly. Malfoy to provide advance notice of any required co-signatures, no fewer than 48 hours before deadline. No contact outside scheduled meetings unless strictly necessary. That last line she underlined. Then, after a moment, crossed the underlining out. Then rewrote the line on a fresh section without the underlining, because the underlining had looked, even to her own eyes, slightly panicked. She was not panicked. She was organized. There was a difference. He arrived on Tuesday at 7 o'clock precisely, not 1 minute before, not 1 minute after, as though he had stood outside her building for whatever interval was required to hit the exact appointed second. She noticed this only because she had, without intending to, glanced at the clock at 6:59, and again when she heard the knock. She opened the door. He was wearing a dark jumper this time, charcoal, fine knit, muggle plain, and dark trousers, and he looked, in the warm light spilling from her hallway, like someone who had made peace with being uncomfortable and intended to make it as invisible as possible. His hair was slightly damp at the temples. It had been raining again. She stepped back. He came in. This time he removed his coat. She didn't remark on it. She took it, hung it on the hook by the door with the brisk practicality of someone who had decided to behave normally until behaving normally became the actual situation, and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. "I've drafted terms," she called. "Of course you have," he said, from somewhere in the sitting room. She came back to find him standing at her bookshelf, not browsing exactly, but reading the spines with the attentive stillness of someone who thinks they are not being observed. His head was tilted slightly. His right hand was at his side, index finger extended just barely toward one of the volumes. Advanced Magical Jurisprudence, 3rd edition. And then pulled back before it made contact, as though he'd caught himself doing something he hadn't decided to do. She set the drafted terms on the table. She did not mention the bookshelf. He turned. He looked at the parchment. He looked at her. "Sit," she said. "Please." He sat in the same chair as before, as though it had been assigned to him, which she supposed in a way it now had. She sat across from him and pushed the parchment in his direction. He read it, all of it. Unlike her, she noted, with a private flicker of something she chose not to name. "Tuesday at 7, he said. "It's a neutral time, not too close to the weekend." I wasn't objecting. I was reading. He turned the page. His eyes moved through the co-signature clause, the 48-hour provision, the language she'd borrowed from the Surety Act itself. "This is thorough. I'm aware. It reads like a contract. It is a contract." A pause. He set the parchment down. He looked at her across the low table with the rain making its soft, insistent sound against the window glass. And she had the sudden, distinct impression that he was deciding something. Not about the terms, but about her, or about the version of this situation he was going to inhabit. "Fine," he said. "You agree to all of it." "I'll behave within whatever framework you require," he said. The phrasing was careful, calibrated, stripped of inflection. "I have no interest in making this more complicated than it already is." She wanted, briefly, to say something. Something that acknowledged the strangeness of the sentence, the particular quality of its resignation, the fact that Draco Malfoy had just sat in her sitting room and agreed, without condition or negotiation, to behave within whatever framework she required. She found she had no language for it that wasn't either too soft or too clinical, so she said nothing and reached for her tea instead. The kettle, she realized, she'd forgotten to finish making. She stood up. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a moment with both hands flat on the cool surface, looking at the window above the sink, where the rain drew thin grey lines down the glass. He looked thinner. The thought arrived without invitation. Not unwell, exactly. Just used. Like something that has been running on its own reserves for longer than was sustainable. She poured the tea. The first rule he broke was on Thursday. She found out via OWL, a ministry notification, ministry purple envelope, her name in official script, that one Draco Malfoy had attempted to enter into a contract for the lease of a studio workspace in Diagon Alley without obtaining guardian co-signature as required under Section 4 EC of the Emergency Magical Surety Act. The contract had been declined automatically by the ministry's enchanted filing system. He had been sent a formal notice of non-compliance. So had she. She held the letter for a full 30 seconds without moving. Then she put on her coat and went to find him. The address she had for him was a flat in a narrow building off Charing Cross Road, the sort of building that existed in the borderland between the Muggle world and Diagon Alley. Visible from neither, accessible to those who knew which doorway to approach from the east. She had the address from the ministry file. She had not expected to use it before Tuesday. She knocked. The door opened after a moment. He was in shirt sleeves, the dark grey jumper replaced by a white linen shirt, collar open, cuffs rolled to the elbow. And he was holding a piece of chalk, of all things. And he looked at her arrival the way someone looks at weather they had predicted, but not expected to actually materialize. "Granger," he said. She held up the ministry letter. He looked at it, his jaw set. He looked back at her. "Come in," he said, and stepped back without further ceremony. The flat was spare to the point of austerity, not barren, but stripped, like someone had removed everything decorative as a deliberate exercise. There were books, stacked with precision on makeshift shelves made of planks and bricks, the kind of arrangement that suggested temporary habitation had extended longer than planned. A work table along one wall was covered in papers. Architectural drawings, she realized, looking closer. Detailed, precise, rendered in pencil and chalk. Buildings, floor plans, something that looked like a redesign of a magical space's structural wards. She hadn't known he drew. She filed this away without comment. "You tried to lease a workspace," she said. "I need a workspace. You need my signature to lease one." "I was testing the system," he said, and moved to the table and set down the chalk with a care that was slightly too deliberate. To see whether the restriction was enforced automatically or required manual flagging. "It's enchanted," she said. "Everything at the ministry is enchanted. Now I know that. You knew that before." He turned. There was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. A dry, controlled amusement that lived mostly around the corners of his eyes. "I wanted to confirm it." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The amusement was still there, and beneath it, something she couldn't fully identify. Not defiance. Something older. The residue of someone who had spent a long time finding small tests preferable to large questions. 48 hours, she said. "You send me the paperwork. I review it. I sign it if it's reasonable. And if you decide it's not reasonable, then we discuss it. And if we disagree, then I explain my reasoning. And if I find your reasoning," he paused, "unconvincing." The question wasn't hostile. It was genuinely curious, she realized. The kind of curiosity that comes from someone who is working out, in real time whether a system is actually functional or merely decorative. Then you may write a formal letter of objection to the ministry, she said, which I'm told takes approximately 6 weeks to process. The almost smile returned. You've read the full charter. I've read everything. She set the ministry letter on his work table beside the chalk. Send me the lease documents. I'll look at them tonight. He said nothing for a moment. The rain had followed her here. She could hear it against the single window, a different sound than her flat, thinner, more metallic, like something pattering against a drain cover. His flat smelled of chalk dust and old paper and something faintly resinous, like the inside of a wooden chest. Why? He said. She frowned. Why what? Why tonight? You could make me wait 48 hours. That's the rule you wrote. Do you want to wait 48 hours? He said nothing. The workspace, she said carefully. The drawings. She glanced at the table, the precise pencil lines, the careful spatial logic laid out across a dozen sheets. How long have you been working on this? The silence had a different quality now. Not resistant, just present, the way a held breath is present. Since February, he said. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. February was 3 months after the end of the trials, 2 months into his probation, 6 months of whatever this was. This spare flat, this borrowed table, this chalk and paper architecture, built in a space barely large enough to contain it. Send me the documents, she said. I'll look at them tonight. She picked up her coat. She moved toward the door. Granger. She stopped. You came here yourself, he said. You could have sent an owl. She turned slightly, enough to see his profile, the sharp jaw, the careful stillness of his posture, the chalk dust still faintly white on the inside of his wrist. I could have, she agreed. She left. She descended the narrow stairs and stepped back out into the rain and walked half a block before she admitted to herself what she had done. She had come because a letter had felt, in some way she could not yet articulate, like too much distance. She had come because she had looked at his address in the ministry file and thought, without deciding to think it, I should make sure it's a real place. The lease documents arrived by owl at 9 that evening. She read them, all of them, and signed. She sent them back with a note containing only the address of the workspace office and the words, approved. Next time, 48 hours. His reply came at 11, a single line of his precise, slightly archaic handwriting. Noted. M. She set the note on her desk. She looked at it for a moment. The candle at her elbow threw warm light across the page, across that single initial, the deliberate period after it, the clean economy of a person who had decided to say exactly as much as the situation required, and not one syllable more. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about architectural drawings on a work table in a sparse flat off Charing Cross Road, and the chalk dust on the inside of his wrist, and the way he had said since February, not defensively, not proudly, just with the flat precision of someone reporting a fact they had no particular need to protect. She thought about what it meant to rebuild something when the building itself was the evidence of what had been lost. She turned over. She slept. The Ministry of Magic on a Wednesday morning had the particular atmosphere of a place that had recently survived something enormous and was still, quietly, not quite sure what to do with the silence that followed. The atrium had been restored, the fountain rebuilt, the golden figures returned to their places. But there was something in the way people moved through it, a collective held breath quality, as though everyone had agreed without discussion to treat the marble floors with a specific, provisional care. Hermione arrived at 8:45. Draco arrived at 8:46. She knew this because she was standing near the fountain watching the gilded figures pour their eternal water into the basin, and she heard his footsteps before she saw him. A measured, unhurried sound against stone that she had apparently, without intending to, already filed somewhere in her memory as distinctly his. He was wearing dark trousers and a charcoal jacket, and his hair was that careful version of uncurated, pushed back, slightly longer than it had been in school. He carried nothing. No bag, no documents. His hands were in his pockets, and his face was arranged in the expression she was beginning to recognize as his default public setting. Composed, faintly remote, the social equivalent of a locked room. "You're late," she said, "by 1 minute. The appointment is at 9. We should be upstairs by 8:50. He looked at her. "We have 14 minutes. 13 now." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the shadow a smile leaves when it decides not to fully materialize. He fell into step beside her as she moved toward the lifts, and for a moment they walked in silence through the restored atrium, and she was aware, with an uncomfortable precision, of the people who looked. Not many, just a few. The quick glances, the brief interruptions of forward motion, the recognitions that moved across faces and were then deliberately smoothed away. She did not look at him to see whether he noticed. He noticed everything. She had established this already. The lift smelled of polish and something faintly electrical, the aftermath of proximity to too many wands in an enclosed space. They stood on opposite sides of it, which was perhaps excessive in a lift this small, but felt, nonetheless, like the appropriate geometry. The arrow above the doors ticked upward. 3rd floor, 4th. "What do they ask?" he said without preamble. "At these check-ins?" "Standard probationary review. Employment status, residential stability, magical compliance. They'll ask about our contact record, frequency, nature, any incidents." "Incidents?" he repeated. "The Thursday letter counts as an incident." "I thought we resolved that." "We did. I'll note the resolution. It demonstrates the system functioning as intended, which is actually—" She searched for the right framing. "Favorable. It shows active guardianship." He was quiet for a moment. The lift lurched gently at the 5th floor, admitted no one, continued. "You've prepared talking points," he said. It was not a question. "I've prepared a summary of our first 2 meetings, the terms agreement, the lease documentation, and the resolution of the compliance notice." A pause. "Of course you have. Is that a problem?" "It's very you," he said, and the way he said it, not mockingly, just observationally, with a faint precision, did something unexpected to the air in the small space between them. She kept her eyes on the floor indicator. 8th floor, she said, when it arrived. The Office of Magical Rehabilitation and Surety was smaller than she expected. A waiting room with 4 chairs, a water jug on a table, and a window that looked out onto an interior shaft of the ministry rather than the sky. The woman at the desk was middle-aged with reading glasses and the focused efficiency of someone who had processed a very large number of difficult cases and had developed, as a result, a highly specific compassion, thorough, professional, and entirely free of sentiment. Her name, the plaque said, was Assessor Prentice. "Miss Granger," she said, rising slightly, "and Mr. Malfoy." A brief, practiced pause that contained, in its brevity, an entire protocol. "Please, sit." They sat, side by side this time, because the chairs were arranged that way, and rearranging them would have been conspicuous. The armrests were almost touching. She was very aware of his left arm, 2 inches from her right, and the particular quality of his stillness. The way he sat without fidgeting, without adjusting, like someone who had learned, somewhere along the line, to make himself difficult to read through sheer physical economy. Assessor Prentice opened a file. "I'll begin with some standard questions for the record," she said. "Mr. Malfoy, current residence." He gave the Charing Cross Road address. "Employment. Freelance architectural consultation, magical spatial design." She wrote this down. Hermione, who had not known his employment was formalized enough to have a title, kept her expression neutral. "Miss Granger, can you confirm regular contact has been maintained?" "Weekly meetings, Tuesdays at 7. We've had 2 formal meetings and 1 additional contact for a compliance matter, which was resolved within the same day." The compliance notice of the 14th. Prentice found the page. The workspace lease attempt. Yes. Documentation was provided and co-signed within 12 hours of the notice. Prentice looked at Draco over her glasses. "Mr. Malfoy, do you understand the requirement for advance co-signature on financial contracts?" "I do now," he said. "Perfectly pleasant, perfectly empty of everything." "Good." She made a note. She turned a page. She asked several more questions. Hermione answered most of them. Draco answered the ones directed specifically at him, and they existed for 23 minutes in the strange social construction of 2 people presenting themselves as a functional unit to a government official while sitting in chairs with almost touching armrests in a windowless room. Then Prentice said, "And how would you describe the general nature of the guardianship relationship?" The question fell into a small silence. Hermione opened her mouth. "Functional," Draco said at the same moment. She closed her mouth. She looked at him. He was looking at Prentice with the same composed attention he'd brought to everything else in this room. "Functional," Prentice repeated, writing it down. "Anything to add, Miss Granger?" "It's developing well," Hermione said, which was either entirely true or completely invented, and she wasn't sure which, and the uncertainty sat in her chest with a specific, not unpleasant weight. Prentice nodded. She closed the file with a decisive motion of someone who had heard everything she needed. "We'll schedule the next review in 6 weeks. In the meantime, continue maintaining your contact log. Miss Granger, you have access to the shared ministry record, yes?" "Yes." "Excellent." She rose. They rose. "Mr. Malfoy." A slight nod. Something in it, not warmth but acknowledgement, the kind extended to someone navigating something difficult with visible effort. He received it without reaction, which was, Hermione suspected, its own kind of effort. They were back in the atrium by 9:10. The fountain caught the light from the enchanted ceiling above, that perpetual blue sky simulation, always slightly too perfect, the sky of a place that had needed badly to believe in good weather. Hermione stood at the edge of it and looked up for a moment, and the spray from the fountain made the air immediately around them cool and faintly mineral. "Magical spatial design," she said. Is that what you're calling it officially?" "It's what it is." He had stopped a few feet to her left and was looking at the fountain rather than her. Magical structures deteriorate differently than Muggle ones. The ward architecture embedded in old buildings, Hogwarts, the old ministry annexes, most of Diagon Alley. It needs redesigning post-war. The spellwork is compromised. Someone has to map it. And you do that. I've done 2 consultations. A fractional pause. 3, if the Hogsmeade project confirms. She turned to look at him. The atrium light fell across the angle of his face, and she saw something she hadn't seen in the closed, careful setting of the check-in office. A very slight animation, barely there, the way a face changes when a person speaks about the specific thing they have privately decided is worth continuing for. "The Hogsmeade project," she said. "Rebuilding the structural ward lattice in the older buildings on the High Street. The post-battle damage destabilized the spellwork in the foundations." He caught himself. She watched him do it. The micro-adjustment, the return to neutrality. "It's technical. I don't need to explain it." "I'd like you to," she said. He looked at her then. Really looked. The grey eyes doing that focused, assessing thing that she had learned was not surveillance, but something closer to calibration, checking the distance between what was said and what was meant. "Why?" he said. The question was simple. It was also, she understood, not about the Hogsmeade project at all. "Because you clearly know what you're talking about," she said. "And I've been reading ministry files about you for 2 weeks, and none of them mention this, and I'd rather know who you actually are than who the paperwork says you are." The fountain made its soft, continuous sound. Someone crossed the atrium behind them, footsteps quick and purposeful, fading. The enchanted ceiling above shifted through a slow, imperceptible drift toward mid-morning. "That's a very direct thing to say," he said. "I'm a very direct person." "I know." Something in his voice, not warmth, but its precursor, the atmospheric condition that precedes warmth, the way a particular quality of light precedes rain. "I remember." She turned back toward the fountain. Her reflection in the dark water was wavering, distorted by the ripples. "The Hogsmeade project," she said. "Tell me about the ward lattice." And he did. Not all of it. Not in the atrium of the ministry on a Wednesday morning with people moving around them and the clock above the lifts showing 9:20. But enough. He spoke in the careful, slightly technical language of someone who had taught themselves a discipline in private and hadn't yet learned how to translate it for general audiences. And she listened without interrupting, and the fountain continued its patient work beside them. And it was... She would think about this later, trying to identify when the shape of things had first begun to change. It was the first time they had spoken without the document between them. Without the terms, the charter, the ministry letter, the parchment with its official seals and sub-clauses. Without the scaffolding, just his voice, describing something he had built from the rubble of everything else, and her attention, full and unguarded, receiving it. When he stopped, she didn't immediately fill the silence. Neither did he. They stood there for a moment that had no particular function, no agenda, no documentation, no framework, and the fountain spray made tiny cold points of contact on the back of her hand, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "He is trying to rebuild something true, not just buildings." "I'll need to co-sign the Hogsmeade contract," she said. "Send it when it arrives." 48 hours, he said. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said, "that I'm told once." She glanced at him. The almost smile was there again, and this time it stayed a fraction longer before it decided against itself. She tucked her folder under her arm. She needed to be upstairs by 10:30, and the lifts were across the atrium, and she had a contact log to update and a 6-week review to begin preparing for. And all of this was true, and all of it was, in this particular moment, slightly less loud than it usually was. "Tuesday," she said. 7 o'clock, he said. She walked toward the lifts. She did not look back. She was almost certain he stayed by the fountain a moment longer before he left. She was almost certain, though she could not have said precisely why, that he watched her go. Not the way one watches someone they are assessing, but the way one watches something they are slowly, carefully, beginning to allow themselves to look at directly. She pressed the button for the lift. The arrow began its upward climb. She smoothed the front of her folder with her thumb, a small, unnecessary motion, straightening something that was already perfectly straight. The Hogsmeade contract arrived on a Friday, which was not a Tuesday, and not 48 hours before any particular deadline, which meant he had sent it the moment it was confirmed, and had not, this time, tested anything. She noticed this. She didn't mention it. She read the contract at her kitchen table with a second cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, the Friday evening quiet settling around her flat like sediment. And the more she read, the more she understood that this was not a small project. The ward lattice redesign for 6 buildings on the High Street, 3 of them pre-17th century, 2 with compound spellwork layered across 400 years of magical habitation, was, by any architectural measure, significant work. The kind of work that required not just technical competence, but a specific, almost archaeological patience. The kind of work that required someone to care about what they were preserving. She signed it. She added a note, not the standard approved, HG she had sent with the lease, but 3 lines. The spellwork mapping on the Honeydukes building will be particularly complex, given the confectionery enchantments layered into the structure since 1641. If you need access to the Hogwarts architectural records for comparison reference, I can arrange it. Granger. She sent it before she could reconsider the extra lines. His reply came the following morning, a Saturday at 7:43, which meant he had been awake and working before 8 on a weekend, which meant nothing, which she noted anyway. The Honeydukes enchantments are the most interesting part. I've already sourced the 1641 survey through the Wizarding Heritage Trust. The Hogwarts comparison would be useful, particularly the Astronomy Tower foundations, if accessible. She arranged access by Monday. Tuesday came with low cloud and the smell of rain not yet fallen, and she opened the door at 7 o'clock to find him holding 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner. The Muggle coffee place, the one with the green sign, the one she went to every morning. She looked at the cups. He looked at her looking at the cups. You mentioned it, he said. 3 weeks ago. You said the ministry canteen coffee tasted like regret, and you'd been stopping at the corner place since October. She had said that. She remembered saying it in passing, filling a silence between the terms agreement and the discussion of the compliance charter. She had not expected him to retain it, or act on it, or show up with evidence of both. I didn't know you knew where it was, she said. It's on the corner, he said. It's not a cryptographic challenge. She took the cup. Their fingers did not touch in the exchange. He had managed the handoff with a precision that precluded contact, which he suspected was deliberate and chose not to examine. The coffee was the right order. She had not told him her order. She didn't ask how he knew. She stepped back and let him in. They had developed, over 3 weeks, a rhythm that neither of them had formally acknowledged. He arrived. She made tea, or now didn't need to. They sat, he in the chair, she on the sofa, and worked through whatever the ministry required of them that week. The contact log, the co-signatures, the forms that the Surety Act generated with the reliable abundance of a system designed by people who believed paperwork was the same as safety. But the paperwork had been getting shorter. Not because there was less of it, there wasn't, but because they had become more efficient, had developed a shorthand, a way of moving through the administrative landscape of their arrangement with less friction than the early weeks had required. And the time that the paperwork no longer filled had to go somewhere. It went into conversation. Not always intentional, not always comfortable, but present, increasingly unavoidably present, the way light comes into a room, not through the door you opened, but through the window you forgot was there. Tonight, he was telling her about the Honeydukes building, about the way the confectionery enchantments had crystallized into the stone over centuries, literally. The walls, when he'd done the initial survey, had tested faintly sweet. The spellwork so thoroughly integrated into the physical structure that separating the ward lattice from the building's essential character was like trying to extract flavor from something that had been slow cooked for 400 years. You can't remove it, he said. You have to work around it. Map where it's structurally load-bearing and route the new lattice to complement rather than replace. He had his coffee in one hand and was using the other to demonstrate something in the air above the table. A spatial gesture, the rough, three-dimensional shape of what he was describing. And she was watching his hands without fully deciding to, because they were expressive in a way the rest of him carefully wasn't. It changes the whole design logic. Instead of a clean rebuild, you're doing something more like restoration. Restoration rather than reconstruction, she said. Yes, something settled in his face. The particular quality of recognition when someone understands not just the words, but the distinction beneath them. Exactly. She looked at her coffee cup. Outside, the rain had finally made up its mind and was falling in a quiet, steady way that made the flat feel very enclosed and very warm. Is that what you prefer? She asked. Restoration? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasively. She had learned to tell the difference. This was the quiet of someone actually considering, actually locating an honest answer rather than a performative one. It's more honest, he said. Reconstruction pretends the original wasn't there. Restoration admits it. A pause. admits what it was. What happened to it? She looked at him then. He was looking at the coffee cup in his hand, turning it slightly, the cardboard sleeve making a soft friction sound against his palm. "That sounds personal," she said. "Most things are," he said, "if you pay enough attention." It was 8:20 when she went to the kitchen for water and came back to find him standing at the bookshelf again. Not looking this time, but reading, actually reading. A slim volume he had taken from the third shelf that she recognized as Magical Theory and the Architecture of Belief by Eudora Finch Fletchley. It was not a well-known book. It was the kind of book that required a specific kind of reader, someone who found the philosophy of how magic worked as interesting as the mechanics. He was reading the introduction. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he became aware of her. He looked up. He looked at the book. He looked back at her with the expression of someone caught not doing anything wrong, but doing something private. "It was on the shelf," he said. "I can see that. I wasn't going to damage it. I know." He closed it. He held it for a moment before putting it back, spine aligned, exactly where it had been. And she thought about what it would be like to live in that flat off Charing Cross Road, with its plank and brick shelves and its work table and its chalked architectural drawings. And to come here on Tuesday evenings and stand at a wall of books and feel the particular specific gravity of a room that had been lived in by someone who loved reading the way some people love breathing. "You can borrow it," she said. He looked at her. "If you want," she said. "The Finch Fletchley. It's relevant to the ward lattice theory. She has a chapter on belief structures in pre-industrial magical architecture that would probably interest you." A long beat. "I'll return it," he said. "I know you will." He took it from the shelf again. He held it with a care that was almost formal. 2 hands, spine supported. And she thought, not for the first time, that Draco Malfoy treated objects of value with a reverence that had nothing to do with their monetary worth, and everything to do with some private system of what deserved to be handled carefully. She wondered what else was on that list. She saw it just before 9. He had put his jacket back on. They were winding down, the contact log updated, the paperwork complete. And he was reaching for his coat on the hook by the door, and his sleeve rode up with the motion of reaching, and she saw it. The mark. Not in full, just the edge of it, the uppermost arc of the dark ink against the inside of his left forearm, visible for the duration of a single mundane movement, and then covered again by the dropped sleeve. She had known it was there. Of course she had known. It was in the ministry file. It was part of the legal history. It was a documented fact. Knowing it was there and seeing it, even partially, even briefly, were different things. The difference arrived in her chest with a specific and unwelcome force. Not pity. She did not think it was pity, but something adjacent. Something that understood without wanting to that the distance between who someone was and who they had been made to become could be a very small and very catastrophic space. She said nothing. He hadn't noticed her notice. He pulled his coat on. He picked up the borrowed book, held it for a moment, and then, with a movement that was so small it barely registered, tucked it carefully inside his coat, against his chest, as though it was something he didn't want damaged by the rain. "Tuesday," he said at the door. "Tuesday," she said. He left. She stood very still in the middle of her sitting room for a moment, in the warm lamplight, with the rain against the window and the indent still visible in the chair cushion where he sat every week. And she pressed her fingers against her sternum briefly. Once, hard, the way you press against something to check whether it's tender. It was. She went to her desk. She opened the contact log. In the notes field, where she usually wrote meeting conducted per schedule, no incidents, she wrote, meeting conducted per schedule, no incidents. Subject discussed current project work at length. Significant technical and conceptual depth. Demonstrated consistent compliance. She stopped. She looked at the word subject. She deleted it. She wrote he instead, and then deleted that too, and sat for a long moment with the cursor blinking in the empty field, and then wrote only, no incidents, everything as expected. She closed the log. She looked at the shelf where the Finch Fletchley had been. The gap it left was very small, barely visible, the kind of absence you would only notice if you knew exactly what had been there before. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed, and she lay in the dark, and she thought about restoration versus reconstruction, and the edge of dark ink against pale skin, and the specific care with which a person can tuck a borrowed book against their chest in the rain. And she understood with the particular resignation of someone watching an inevitable thing arrive from a very long distance that she was in considerable trouble. The book came back on a Thursday, not Tuesday. Thursday, which was outside the scheduled contact window, which technically violated the no contact outside meetings unless strictly necessary clause she had written herself and underlined and then ununderlined, and which she had not, if she were being honest, enforced with any particular rigour since approximately the second week. The owl arrived at 6:30 in the evening. A ministry standard tawny, not his own, which meant he had borrowed or hired it, carrying the Finch Fletchley and a folded note, and she untied both from the bird's leg at her kitchen window while her pasta water came to a boil behind her. The book was wrapped in brown paper against the rain. The paper was dry, which meant he had wrapped it carefully before sending, not after. She opened the note. Chapter 7 is wrong. The premise about belief architecture in pre-Reformation magical structures assumes a uniformity of intent that the historical record doesn't support. I've marked the relevant passages. M. She opened the book. He had marked 3 passages in the margins. Not with ink, she noticed, but with a very light pencil, the kind of annotation that could be erased without trace, as though he had wanted to leave his thinking there, but had not presumed to make it permanent. The notes were precise, and, reading them, she felt the specific quality of intellectual irritation that only arrived when someone made a good argument against something she believed. He was right about Chapter 7. She wrote back immediately before the pasta was finished. Chapter 7 has been bothering me since 2003. You're right about the uniformity assumption, but wrong about the conclusion. Finch Fletchley's error doesn't invalidate the framework. It just requires adjustment. The Hogsmeade lattice should demonstrate this. Granger. She sent it and ate her pasta, and did not think about the fact that she had just initiated contact outside the scheduled window without any administrative justification whatsoever. His reply arrived while she was washing up. Dinner and a theological argument about pre-Reformation ward theory. Your Thursday evenings are apparently more interesting than I assumed. The lattice will not demonstrate anything except that I'm right. M. She read this twice. Then she read it a third time, focusing specifically on the word dinner. The implication that he had correctly inferred she was eating, the faint, dry quality of the observation, the way it occupied the exact border between social observation and something that could not quite decide what it was. She put her phone, her muggle phone, which she used for notes and timers and the occasional very unmagical moment of needing to look something up instantly, on the counter face down. She was smiling. She stopped smiling. She went to bed. The following Tuesday, he arrived with coffee again. Same order, same corner shop, and she had, without making a decision about it, made tea as well. So there were 4 cups on the table between them, which was too many, and neither of them mentioned it. The ministry paperwork that week was minimal. The 6-week review documentation, a single co-signature for a ward consultation invoice, the updated contact log. They moved through it in 40 minutes, which left over an hour of the evening with no administrative justification. She had prepared for this. She had told herself she hadn't, but she had. "I want to see the Hogsmeade site," she said. He looked up from the invoice he was signing. "Why?" "Because I've been co-signing documentation for a project I've never seen. And because..." She organized the signed papers into a neat stack, edges perfectly aligned. "I think you're wrong about the Finch-Fletchley conclusion, and I'd like to look at the evidence." A pause. He set the quill down. He looked at her with the calibrating attention she had become, without entirely meaning to, quite fluent in reading. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday. It's a working site. Wear something you don't mind getting chalk on." She looked at him. "I'm not going to get chalk on me." "You're going to touch the walls," he said. "Everyone touches the walls. They can't help it." He picked up his coffee. "There's something in the spell work. It draws the hand." She thought about this. She thought about 400-year-old confectionery enchantments crystallized into stone, drawing the hand of everyone who passed. "Saturday," she said. Hogsmeade in early April had the particular quality of a place reassembling itself after long illness. Tentative sunshine, scaffolding on 3 buildings along the high street, window boxes with new plantings that looked slightly uncertain about the whole enterprise. The 3 broomsticks had new glass in 2 of its windows. The post office had a fresh coat of paint the exact same colour as the original, which somehow made the newness more visible rather than less. He was waiting outside the Honeyduke's building when she arrived, 8 minutes early, and he was holding a folded architectural drawing and looking at the upper facade with the specific concentration of someone having a quiet argument with a building. He heard her footsteps on the cobblestones and turned. She was wearing her practical coat, navy wool, the one she wore to field research, and boots, and she had her bag, and she was 8 minutes early, which meant she had apparated from 2 streets away, rather than arriving directly to avoid being obviously early, which she was aware was the kind of thing she did, and was not particularly proud of. He didn't comment on her arrival time. He looked at her coat. "Good," he said. "Good what?" "The coat. It's practical." He turned back to the building. "Come here." I want to show you something." She came to stand beside him. The building's facade was pale stone, old in the way very old magical buildings were old. Not worn exactly, but layered, the surface carrying evidence of every decade of its existence, like rings in wood. The scaffolding covered the left third of it. At street level, where the scaffolding met the wall, she could see the faint glimmer of exposed spellwork, not visible in ordinary light, but she had put on her spell sight the moment she'd arrived. A habit. And through it, the wall was alive with layered enchantment, complex and interwoven, and very, very old. "There," he said, pointing to a section near the ground where the old latticework showed a structural fault, a gap in the enchantment, irregular like a crack in stained glass. That's where the war damage propagated. The original impact was 3 streets away, but the lattice conducted the disruption. It spread along the weakest channels, here and here. His finger traced a line in the air before the wall, mapping something she could only partially see. "If I rebuild from the gap outward, I reinforce the damage pattern. I have to go back further, to where the lattice was still intact, and rebuild forward. Restoration from the point of health, rather than the point of damage," she said. He lowered his hand. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. They stood for a moment in the thin April sunshine, with the architectural drawing between them and the building's 400-year-old spellwork, glimmering in spell sight. And somewhere down the street, someone was opening a shop, the sound of a key in a lock carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. "Touch it," he said. "I'm not going to." "Touch the wall, Granger." She touched the wall. The stone was cool under her palm, and then, in the space of 2 heartbeats, it wasn't. Or rather, it was still cool, but there was something else beneath the temperature. Something that pressed back very gently against her hand. Not warmth, but presence. The faint, magnetic insistence of spellwork that had been feeding on belief and intention for 4 centuries, and had developed, across that time, something close to its own gravity. She held her hand there longer than she'd intended. "I told you," he said, and there was no smugness in it, just the quiet accuracy of someone who had already been through this exact moment of discovery and remembered it. She pulled her hand back. She looked at her palm, which was ordinary, unmarked, slightly chalky. "There it is," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Not fond, not warm, nothing so legible as that. It was something quieter, the look of someone watching a thing they had expected to happen and finding, in its happening, that they had underestimated how much they wanted to see it. She looked away first. They spent 2 hours at the site. He showed her the survey maps, the lattice diagrams, the specific challenge of each building in sequence. She asked questions, good ones, questions that made him stop and think and occasionally revise what he'd said mid-sentence. And she could see, with a clarity that had nothing to do with spell sight, that he was not accustomed to being questioned well. He was accustomed to being questioned skeptically or performatively, or not at all. This was different, and she watched the difference register in him gradually, a slow adjustment, like a building settling. He was, she thought, exceptional at this. Not just competent, exceptional. The way he held 2 spatial problems in mind simultaneously while explaining a third. The way his hands moved when he was working through something difficult, that three-dimensional gesture she had first noticed in her sitting room, now applied to real stone and real spellwork, and a real lattice that needed rebuilding. At 10:30, they sat on the steps of the building across the street, closed for restoration, no inhabitants to disturb, and ate the sandwiches she had brought without telling him she was bringing, and drank the coffee he had brought without telling her he was bringing. And the morning had reached that particular quality of mid-spring Saturday, where the light was doing everything correctly, and the air smelled of old stone and new growth, and somewhere, faintly, of sugar, which was the honeyduke's enchantment exhaling into the street. "The Chapter 7 argument," she said, between bites. "I've been thinking about it." "I know. You don't know. You've been thinking about it since Thursday. It's the kind of argument you don't drop." She considered denying this. She didn't. Finch Fletchley's error is in the framing, not the conclusion. She assumes uniformity of intent because she's looking at the output, the spellwork as it exists. She's not accounting for the process. Multiple intents over time can produce a unified output if the underlying belief structure is coherent, he said. "Coherent," she agreed. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the Honeyduke's building across the street. At the lattice, she could still see glimmering faintly in spell sight, and his sandwich was half eaten and forgotten in his hand. "Multiple intents," he said, "producing coherence over time." "If the foundation is sound," she said. He looked at her then. The grey eyes were very direct in the April light, the careful remoteness of his public face entirely absent. She wasn't sure when it had gone, only that it had, somewhere between the first hour of the site visit and now, and what was there instead was something unguarded in a way that made her chest do the particular thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in his presence. That pressurized, compressed sensation of something trying to expand into insufficient space. "I think you've just argued," he said quietly, "that Finch Fletchley is right." "I've argued that she's right for the wrong reasons," she said, "which is almost worse." He looked back at the building. Something at the corner of his mouth made its familiar, almost movement, and this time it went slightly further. Not quite a smile, but the full shape of one, visible for a moment before he caught it. She saw it. She said nothing. She ate her sandwich. The enchanted sugar scent of honeydukes drifted across the street in the warm air, and the scaffolding threw thin barred shadows across the cobblestones. And she thought about multiple intents producing coherence over time, and whether the foundation was sound, and whether that was a question about ward lattices or about something else entirely. And she thought that she already knew the answer, and that the answer was doing something irreversible to the neat, administrative structure she had built around these Tuesday evenings and this person and whatever this was becoming. She did not say any of this. She finished her sandwich. He finished his coffee. They sat for another 20 minutes in the April sunshine, not talking, and it was the most comfortable silence she had been inside in longer than she could easily remember. And that was, she thought, the most alarming thing yet. The ministry sent a supplementary form on a Wednesday. Hermione read it standing at her kitchen counter at 7 in the morning, with her first cup of coffee steaming beside her, still in her dressing gown. And she read it twice because the first time produced a response she didn't trust, and the second time produced the same response, which meant it was accurate. The form was a relationship classification amendment, a subclause of the Surety Act she hadn't encountered before, buried in a section titled Guardian Ward Dynamic Assessment, which required both parties to classify the nature of their relationship from a ministry-approved list. The list contained 6 options: formal, professional, cooperative, familiar, personal, other. She set the form down. She picked up her coffee. She put the coffee down without drinking it. The form required both signatures within 14 days. There was a notes field at the bottom, 3 lines, for any relevant context the parties wished to provide. She looked at the notes field for a long time. It looked back at her, blank and patient, with the mute expectation of all government forms that believe, in their rectangular hearts, that 3 lines are sufficient for anything. She folded the form and put it in her bag and went to get dressed, and did not think about it for the rest of the morning, which was not the same as not thinking about it, but was the closest available approximation. She thought about it at lunch. She thought about it between a planning meeting and a filing review, in the 7-minute window that existed between those 2 things, where she stood in the corridor outside the Department of Magical Law and looked at the enchanted window. Another interior shaft, no real sky, the same quality of simulated light they used everywhere in the building, and held a cup of canteen coffee she didn't want, because having something in her hands was structurally useful. Formal. That was what they had been at the start. That was the word for the first meeting, for the terms on 1.5 pages of narrow-ruled parchment, for the handoff of documents across a table in her sitting room with the careful geometry of 2 people who knew exactly where the boundaries were. Professional was what she had written in the contact log. No incidents. Everything as expected. She tried cooperative and found it accurate in the way a photograph of a landscape is accurate. Technically correct, and entirely missing the quality of light. Familiar was closer. But familiar implied ease, and what they had was not ease. It was something more specific than ease, something with more friction and more texture, something that required more attention than ease ever did. She did not look at the last 2 options. She went back to her desk. She sent him an owl that evening. Ministry form. Classification amendment. I'll bring it Tuesday. His reply arrived in 20 minutes. I've received the same form. We should discuss it before signing. She read this and thought, yes, we should. And also thought, I would rather discuss anything else in the known wizarding world. And also thought, he said we should discuss it, not I'll defer to whatever you decide. Which was, she noticed this, filed it, declined to annotate it. Not nothing. Tuesday, she wrote back. Tuesday, he confirmed. Tuesday arrived with the specific emotional temperature of an appointment you have been not thinking about so comprehensively that by the time it arrives, it feels inevitable in the way only dreaded things do. She had the form in a folder. She had other papers too. The weekly documentation, an invoice for the Hogsmeade project's 2nd phase that needed co-signing, 2 ministry updates on the surety review. So the folder's contents were entirely legitimate, and the form was simply one item among several, and there was no reason for it to feel like the only thing in the folder, but it did. He arrived at 7. Coffee, same order. He sat in his chair. She sat on the sofa. They went through the legitimate paperwork first, efficiently, the shorthand they had developed over 6 weeks, making the work quick and almost comfortable. And she was aware the entire time of the folder's remaining contents, like a specific pressure in the room. She put the form on the table at 7:42. He looked at it. He had his own copy, she could see, folded in the inner pocket of his jacket, the corner of it visible. He left it there. "Have you looked at the options?" she said. "Yes." "And?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands were resting on his knees with a stillness she had learned to read, not as composure, but as effort, the particular quality of someone holding a position very carefully. "What did you choose?" he said. "I haven't signed yet. That's why I brought it." "But you've thought about it." She looked at the form rather than him. "I've thought about it." "What did you land on?" The rain, which had been threatening all day, arrived at this moment against the window. A sudden, decisive sound, the kind of rain that doesn't negotiate. She was grateful for the noise. It made the room feel slightly less like a held breath. "I'm not sure the options on the list," she said carefully, "are adequate." He picked up his coffee. He looked at it. "No," he said, "they're not. We're not formal anymore. No. We're not purely professional. No. Cooperative is—" She searched for the word he had used in her mind. "Insufficient." "Yes." She looked up. He was looking at her. Had been looking at her, she thought, for longer than this sentence, watching her work through the list with the patience of someone who had already done this inventory and arrived at the same impasse. "Familiar," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not disagreement, more like a person standing at the edge of a word, looking at what it contains. "Familiar," he said. "It's the most accurate of the available options." "It is," he agreed, and something in the agreement felt like a door opening to a room they had both been standing outside for some time, not quite deciding to enter. "It is the most accurate of the available options." The qualification hung in the air between them, of the available options, carrying in its careful precision the acknowledgement of what it didn't say, what neither of them was saying. What was present in the room with the same insistent reality as the rain against the window, and the warmth of the lamp, and the indent in the chair cushion, and the growing, irreversible architecture of 20-something Tuesday evenings that had built themselves, brick by brick, into something that had no box on a ministry form. She picked up her quill. She checked familiar. She signed. She passed the form to him. He read the checked box. He looked at it for a moment, that long, assessing look, and then he signed without checking a different box, and the small, tight thing in her chest loosened by precisely 1 degree. He handed it back. Their fingers made contact in the exchange, not avoided this time, just a half-second of warmth, his fingertips against hers, and neither of them acknowledged it, and neither of them pulled back quickly. She put the form in the folder. "The notes field," he said. She had left it blank. "I didn't know what to write," she admitted. He reached across the table and took the folder. He opened it, found the form, uncapped the quill she had left on the table. In the 3-line notes field, in his precise, slightly archaic handwriting, he wrote, "Classification reflects current dynamic, subject to revision." He capped the quill. He handed the folder back. She read the note, subject to revision. 4 words that were, in the language they had developed without naming it, an entire proposition. "That's," she said. "Accurate," he said. "Yes." She closed the folder. She should file it. She should move on to the evening's remaining items, the 6-week review preparation, the Hogsmeade second phase documentation. She did not immediately do any of these things. She sat with the closed folder in her lap, and the rain making its continuous argument against the glass. And he sat in his chair with his coffee and his careful stillness. And the room held them both in the amber lamp warmth, the way rooms do when something has just shifted inside them and the walls haven't caught up yet. "Tell me something," she said. The words arrived before she had fully decided to say them. He waited. "The flat," she said. "Off Charing Cross Road. Is it? Do you plan to stay there?" A slight pause. "For now. It's very sparse. It's sufficient." "That's not the same as—" She stopped. "I know it's not." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, that small rotation she'd seen before, the motion of someone thinking with their hands, because the thought is too unwieldy for stillness. "The estate is still in review. I can't make permanent arrangements until—" A pause. "Until things are resolved." "How long has the review been running?" 14 months. She absorbed this. 14 months of provisional living. 14 months of a flat with plank and brick shelves and a work table and borrowed space, building something careful and real out of chalk and architectural surveys, while the legal machinery processed what remained of everything he'd come from. "I could look at it," she said. "The estate review. I work in magical law reconstruction. It falls under my department's remit. I can't promise anything, but I could, at least—" She caught herself. "If you want me to." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a texture she hadn't encountered from him before. Not resistant, not calculating. Something rawer than either. He was looking at her with an expression that she felt, rather than saw, because she had made the mistake of looking at her folder rather than his face. And she understood from the quality of his silence that this particular offer, practical, framed in professional language, deniable as anything more, had landed somewhere it had not been entirely meant to reach. "You don't have to do that," he said. His voice was very level, a specific kind of level. "I know I don't have to." Another silence. "Granger." He said her name differently then, not the flat, precise pronunciation of the early weeks, not the dry social utility of it, something less armoured. 2 syllables that somehow contained more space than they usually did. "Why are you doing this?" She looked up. His grey eyes were direct and serious, and entirely without the composed remoteness she had watched him wear like weather protection for the past 6 weeks. He looked, without it, different. Younger somehow, and older, both at once. The way people look when they stop performing the version of themselves they've decided is safe. "Because you're good at something important," she said, "and you should be able to do it without a 14-month review hanging over everything. And because," she held his gaze, "because it's the right thing to do." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's," he said, "a very Gryffindor answer. It's the true one." Something moved across his face then, complicated and quick, a sequence of things she could not fully catalogue. He looked down. He set his coffee cup on the table with great care, aligning it with a precision that served no purpose except to give his hands something exact to do. "Thank you," he said, very quiet, very unadorned. She nodded. She opened her bag and found a fresh piece of parchment and her working quill, and wrote down the estate review reference number from his ministry file, which she had, it turned out, memorized without deciding to. The way you memorize the things you have returned to many times in the dark and told yourself you were returning to for professional reasons. She passed him the parchment. "I'll start the inquiry this week," she said. He took it. His hand was steady. Hers, she noticed, was not quite. Outside, the rain had settled into its long-haul register, the kind that commits to the night without apology. The lamp threw its amber geometry across the table, across the folder with the classified form inside, across the 2 coffee cups and the parchment with the reference number, and the narrow space of table between them that was smaller than it had been in the first week, smaller than it had been last Tuesday, shrinking with the reliable, unannounced logic of the distance between 2 people who have stopped, without ceremony or declaration, maintaining it. She picked up the 6-week review documentation. "We should finish this," she said. "Yes," he said, and reached for his quill, and they worked for another 40 minutes in the lamp-warm room while the rain made its case outside, and the form sat in her folder with its 4 careful words, "subject to revision," and the evening held its shape around them like something that had decided, quietly and without announcement, to become more than it was supposed to be. The estate review letter arrived on a Friday morning, and it was not good news. Hermione read it at her desk. Her real desk now, not the converted storage room. She had been moved to a proper office in October with a window that showed actual sky. And she read it with the particular quality of attention she reserved for documents that required her to be very calm, while being not calm at all. The Malfoy estate review had been flagged for extended assessment under a wartime reparations subclause she had not encountered in her initial inquiry. Section 14, F, of the Magical Assets and Restitution Act, which allowed the ministry to extend a financial review indefinitely if evidence emerged suggesting the estate had been used to facilitate or fund wartime criminal activity. The flag had been placed 6 months ago by an assessor in the Department of Magical Finance, whose name she did not recognize. The flag did not specify what evidence had emerged. The flag did not provide a timeline for resolution. The flag simply existed, bureaucratically solid and specifically obstructive, like a wall installed in a corridor with no accompanying explanation. She put the letter down. She picked up her quill. She put her quill down. She stood up, went to her window, looked at the actual sky. Grey, undecided, the kind of April sky that couldn't commit to either rain or clarity, and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose. Then she sat back down and began to write. She sent him an owl before lunch. Not the ministry tawny, her own owl, Ptolemy, a small and extremely opinionated Scops, who had strong feelings about messages he considered beneath his dignity and heroic patience with ones he approved of. He approved of this one, apparently, because he left without complaint and returned in 40 minutes with a reply that told her Draco was available that evening if she wanted to come to the flat. She wanted to come to the flat. She went to the flat. He opened the door before she knocked. He must have heard her footsteps on the stairs. The building was old enough to transmit sound with uncomfortable fidelity. And he looked at her face, and then did not ask how the inquiry had gone, because her face had apparently already answered. He stepped back. She came in. The flat had changed since her first visit. Subtly, the way spaces change when someone has stopped holding them at arm's length. There were more books on the plank shelves, a proper lamp on the work table instead of the conjured light she'd noticed before, a rug on the floor that was clearly good quality and clearly old, the kind of thing rescued from somewhere larger. The architectural drawings had multiplied. 3 walls now carried pinned surveys and lattice diagrams, overlapping, a working cartography of broken magical structures and their proposed repairs. She sat on the small sofa. There was a sofa now where there hadn't been, and he sat across from her in the single chair, and she put the letter on the table between them. He read it. She watched him read it the way she watched him do everything now, with the full attention of someone who has stopped pretending they're not paying attention. His face remained controlled. His jaw did the thing it did when he was processing something difficult, a slight, barely perceptible tightening, a millimeter of movement in the muscle below his cheekbone. His left hand, resting on the arm of the chair, went very still. He read to the end. He put the letter down. Section 14, F, he said. Yes. That's the clause they use when they want to extend a review without providing grounds. Technically, it requires grounds. The flag references evidence without specifying what it is, which is a legal fiction, he said. A legal insufficiency, she said, which I can challenge. He looked at her. The grey eyes were very steady and very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. How long have you known about this flag? He said. I found it this morning. That's not what I asked. She met his gaze. The flag was placed 6 months ago. It would have been in the file when I first accessed the estate review. I didn't. She stopped. I didn't look far enough into the financial documentation on my first pass. I was focused on the legal architecture of the review process, not the specific flags within it. A silence. So, he said, with a care that was its own kind of precision. For 6 months, the reason the review has been unresolvable has been sitting in a document you had access to. Yes. And you found it 2 weeks after you started looking. Yes. He looked away. He looked at the architectural drawings on the wall, the lattice maps, the ward surveys, the careful rebuilding logic spread across 3 walls of a small flat off Charing Cross Road. She watched him look at them and understood, with a clarity that was slightly painful, what she was seeing. A person reckoning with the distance between how long something has been broken and how long it would have taken to fix it if someone had looked properly at the beginning. I'm sorry, she said. He didn't say it's fine. She was grateful for this, for the fact that he had never once, in all their weeks, offered her a false comfort when a true discomfort was more accurate. Can you challenge the flag? He said. Yes, it will take time. These processes always do. But the legal insufficiency is genuine. Section 14, F, requires the flagging assessor to provide specific evidence within 90 days of placing the flag, or the flag becomes legally void. The 90 days elapsed 4 months ago. She watched something shift in his expression. The flag is already void. It just hasn't been formally vacated because no one has filed the challenge. The silence that followed had a different quality, not the held breath kind, more like the moment after a long, sustained pressure releases, the specific, almost physical sensation of something that has been wrong for a long time becoming, suddenly and technically, fixable. "How long?" he said. "To file the challenge? A week. For the ministry to process the vacation and remove the flag from the review. Potentially another 4 to 6 weeks. After that, the review itself." She had looked at this carefully, had mapped the remaining steps with the thorough unhappiness of someone who needed to know the honest answer. Another 3 months, approximately, for a clean resolution. 3 months. "It's not nothing," she said, "but it has an end." He stood up. He moved to the window, the single window looking out onto the narrow street below, where the evening had settled into its blue-grey end-of-day quality, the lamp-posts beginning to make their presence felt against the fading light. He stood with his back to her and his hands in his pockets, and she looked at the line of his shoulders, which were not entirely controlled, which was something she noticed with the particular, helpless accuracy of someone who had been watching a person for long enough to know what controlled looks like on them and what it doesn't. "You didn't have to look into it," he said. He was speaking to the window. "I told you that. I know. I was managing. I know. I had a system." A pause. It wasn't a good system, but it was contained. It wasn't getting worse. She understood what he was saying. She understood it the way you understand something that is also true of yourself. The particular logic of someone who has decided that a manageable problem is preferable to the uncertainty of attempting a solution. The flat, with its provisional shelves and its rescued rug, and its 3 walls of careful work. The stipend, the month-by-month maintenance of a life with no horizon in it, because a life with no horizon at least cannot disappoint you. She stood up. She moved to stand beside him at the window, not quite next to him, a foot of space, the habitual geography, and looked down at the street where a man was walking a small dog with great seriousness, and 2 women stood outside the building opposite, sharing an umbrella over a conversation that had clearly extended past the point where either wanted to be outside. "You were managing," she said. "That's true." She looked at his profile. "But managing isn't the same as living in it." He turned his head. They were close enough that the movement brought his face very near, not startling close, not the proximity of a crisis, just near in the way 2 people standing at the same window are near. And she could see in the dim evening light from outside the precise quality of his expression, which was open in a way she had not seen it before. Not performed openness, not the careful, deliberate lowering of a specific guard, just undefended, unresolved, the face of someone who has run out of the particular energy required to be other than what they are. "Why does it matter to you?" he said, very quietly, not as a challenge, as a genuine question asked at close range from a face with nothing protective left in it. She held his gaze. The question deserved the full weight of an honest answer, and she knew the honest answer and had known it for some time, had been carrying it with the careful management of someone who has decided that a contained thing is preferable to its uncertain release. "You know why?" she said. The words landed in the narrow space between them and stayed there, neither retreating nor advancing, just present, specific, undeniable. He looked at her. The grey eyes moved across her face, not searching, because she thought he had found what he was looking for, but settling, the way eyes do when they stop looking for something, because it is already there. The small dog on the street below produced a sharp, opinionated sound about something invisible. Neither of them moved. "The guardianship review," he said, "ends in 6 weeks." She had known this. She had the date in her contact log with the precision of someone who had been trying not to think about it. Yes. After which, he stopped. His jaw did the thing. He was working through something. She could see it, moving through some internal inventory of what was true and what was permitted, and what the distance was between those two things. After which, "You are no longer required to see me." "No," she said. "I'm not." The word "required" sat between them, doing its work. They both looked at it. They both knew what it was doing. "I'm going to file the challenge on Monday," she said. "I'm going to get the flag vacated, and I'm going to attend every remaining ministry meeting with you until the guardianship ends, because that is what we agreed, and because—" She found she needed to look at the window rather than him to finish the sentence, not from cowardice, but from the opposite, from wanting to say it correctly. "Because Tuesday evenings have become the most consistently interesting part of my week, and I have no intention of them ending, simply because a form tells me they're supposed to." She looked back at him. He was very still. Outside, the evening had gone fully dark now, the lampposts below making amber pools on the wet street, and the window reflected them both back at themselves. Her, in her practical navy coat she hadn't taken off, and him in his charcoal jumper, standing a foot apart at a window in a small flat that had stopped being provisional and started being real without either of them marking the moment it changed. "Granger," he said. "Don't," she said. "Say something dry and deflecting. Not right now." A pause that had the weight of something he was actually holding back, actually choosing against. "I wasn't going to," he said. She looked at him. "I was going to say—" He stopped. He looked at the window, at their reflections, at the street below, and when he looked back at her, there was something in his face she had no historical reference for on him, something that required a different vocabulary than any she had used for him before. "I was going to say that Tuesday evenings are also, that they are the thing I—" He stopped again. His hands had come out of his pockets. They were at his sides, and she could see in the lamplight that his right hand had closed into a loose fist and then opened again. "I'm not good at this." "I know," she said gently. "Neither am I." Something in his expression shifted, something that might, in a different light, in a different vocabulary, be called relief. Outside, a late bus moved along the street below, its windows lit orange, carrying its small cargo of evening passengers past the lampposts and the wet cobblestones, and the building where two people stood at a window in the particular, suspended quiet of a moment that has not yet decided what it will become, but has made, already, its most important determination. Neither of them moved. Neither of them moved away. The challenge filing took 4 days. Hermione submitted it on Monday morning with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that paperwork, at least, is a domain where she can do something useful and immediate. She cited Section 14, F's 90-day evidence requirement, attached the timestamp of the flag's placement, documented the elapsed period with the precision of someone who had stayed up until midnight on Sunday, making absolutely certain every citation was airtight. She submitted it to 3 separate departments simultaneously: Magical Finance, Legal Reconstruction, and the Office of Magical Law Enforcement. Because the Ministry's tendency to lose documents in transit between departments was legendary, and she was not going to let this particular document get lost. She received the first confirmation by Tuesday afternoon. The flag, per the confirmation, was legally void as of the date of original expiry. The estate review would resume standard processing within 30 working days. She sent him an owl with the confirmation attached, and nothing else, no note, and his reply came within the hour. A single line in his precise handwriting, the letters slightly less controlled than usual, as though written quickly. 30 working days. M. And then, beneath it, after a gap that suggested it had been added as an afterthought, or after a decision, thank you. She read it twice. She put it in the folder with the ministry form, with the classification amendment checked familiar and his 4 careful words in the notes field. And she filed the folder in her desk drawer, where she kept things that were not strictly administrative. The Tuesday that followed had a different atmosphere from the others. She felt it before he arrived, in the particular quality of the evening, the April light going slowly golden through her sitting room window, the flat holding its warmth from a day that had finally, genuinely felt like spring, rather than winter's reluctant concession. She had opened the window an inch, and the air that came through smelled of new leaves and the particular dampness of London earth after 3 days without rain. She had made tea. She had also bought good biscuits, the kind from the bakery 2 streets over, not the standard ones she kept in the cupboard for the weekly meetings. She was aware this was a decision that could not be explained in purely administrative terms. She was aware of rather a lot of things she could not explain in purely administrative terms. He arrived at 7. He was carrying coffee. 1 cup, not 2, which meant he'd noticed the tea things on the table when she opened the door and recalibrated without comment, setting his own cup on the side table and accepting the tea she handed him with the ease of someone who had been doing this for long enough that the logistics of it had become instinctive. He sat in his chair. She sat on the sofa. The paperwork was very thin this week. Confirmation receipts, the updated contact log, a single form noting the estate review's return to standard processing. They moved through it in 25 minutes, and the evening stretched ahead of them with its golden light and its open window and its bakery biscuits and its complete absence of administrative justification. He picked up a biscuit. He looked at it with the slight, precise attention he gave to things that represented a departure from the established pattern. "These aren't the usual ones," he said. "No." He looked at her. "I was near the bakery," she said. He ate the biscuit without comment, but the almost smile was there, fully committed for once, not pulling back at the last moment, actually present, actual warmth, and it rearranged his entire face in a way that still, after weeks, produced a specific and unhelpful effect somewhere behind her sternum. She looked at her tea. 6 weeks, he said. She looked up. The guardianship review. He was looking at the window, at the gold-going evening outside. 6 weeks. 5.5, she said. because she had the date memorized to the day, and there was no point pretending otherwise. 5.5 weeks, he agreed. The evening held them in its light for a moment. Outside, a blackbird somewhere close by was producing an extravagant, slightly self-important song, and the sound of it came through the open window like something that had been waiting for its cue. "What happens?" he said. "After." The question was quiet and direct, which was his way. The same directness he had applied to everything once he had stopped armoring it. He was still looking at the window. She was looking at him. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "I know you have." He turned then, and the golden light fell across the angle of his face and caught in the grey of his eyes. And he looked at her with the full, undefended quality she had first seen at his window in the dark, the expression she had no historical reference for, the one that required a different vocabulary. "So have I." "And?" she said. "And I would like," he said very carefully, as though the words were load-bearing and needed to be placed with the same precision he applied toward lattices and architectural surveys, "to continue seeing you outside the framework, without the forms." She held his gaze. Her hands were very still around her teacup. "Just seeing me." A pause. The blackbird made its case to the evening. "No," he said. "Not just." The word landed in the room and stayed. She set her teacup down on the table. She did it with great care, aligning it with the edge of the saucer, a small and wholly unnecessary precision that her hands had required. "When I signed that form," she said, 9 months ago, you didn't read it. I didn't read it." She looked at the table, at the thin stack of completed paperwork, at the folder with its receipts and confirmations, all the bureaucratic evidence of 9 months of accidental proximity. If I had read it, if someone had put it in front of me and said, "Sign here, you will be legally responsible for Draco Malfoy for 1 year." "You would have put the quill down," he said. "Immediately," she agreed. Something moved in his expression, a slight contraction, quickly managed. "But," she said, and waited until he looked at her. "I'm very glad I didn't read it." The contraction reversed. The grey eyes in the evening light were very direct and very still. "That's," he said. "I know." "Granger." "I know," she said again, softer. "I know what it is. I've known for a while." She looked at him steadily. "I think you have too." He stood up. She looked up at him, uncertain for one suspended moment whether he was leaving, whether this was the version of this scene where the admission arrives too early and the other person needs distance. And then he crossed the 2 steps between the chair and the sofa and sat beside her, not at the far end, not with the careful geometry of their usual arrangement, but close, the warmth of him immediately present at her left side, and she turned to face him and found him already facing her. This close, the grey of his eyes was not one thing. It was several, layered, the way old spellwork was layered, the way 400-year-old stone held more than its surface showed. "I have known," he said, "for considerably longer than is comfortable to admit." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not from amusement, but from the particular relief of something true being said plainly. "The coffee," she said. "The first time. Before the first time." He held her gaze. "I knew your order because I had walked past that coffee shop every morning for 6 weeks before the guardianship, because it was between the flat and the tube station, and I had watched you go in every morning at 7:45 in your navy coat with your bag on your left shoulder. And He stopped. His jaw did its thing. I had not intended to do anything about it. She stared at him. You watched me get coffee, she said, for 6 weeks before any of this started. I was in the vicinity, he said, with a dignity that was entirely undercut by the faint colour that had arrived along his cheekbones, a thing she had never seen on him before and which did absolutely catastrophic things to her composure. Draco, she said. His name, not Malfoy. Draco, the 2 syllables she had not used until this moment, and she felt him register it, felt the small, precise shift of his attention that meant something had changed in the architecture of the moment. Yes, he said, very quietly. You are, she said, the most roundabout person I have ever met in my life. I'm aware, he said. And then, after a pause that had the quality of a last held breath before something irrevocable, you signed a form without reading it. I'm also aware, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The blackbird outside had finished its editorial, and the evening was very quiet, and the golden light had gone amber now, the specific amber of a sun that has made its decision and is going unhurriedly toward the horizon. He raised his right hand and placed it very carefully against the side of her face. Not a sudden movement, not an impulsive one, but the movement of someone who has thought about a thing with great precision and is now executing it with the same care they would give to the restoration of something old and worth preserving. His palm was warm. The silver of the ring he wore on his middle finger made a cool point of contact at her temple. She did not move. She let him look at her, let the moment hold its full weight, let it be what it was without managing it into something smaller. I should have, he said, low, close, found a less bureaucratically complicated way to do this. Probably, she said. Although, she reached up and covered his hand with hers, her fingers over his knuckles, the ring warm now from both their temperatures. I think we needed the paperwork. You always need the paperwork. We needed the time, she said. The forms were just the architecture. Something in his face did the final thing. The last wall, the last composed distance, dissolving not dramatically, but simply, the way morning fog dissolves when the sun has been at it long enough. What was left was him, simply, without the structure around it. He leaned forward and kissed her. Not tentatively. That was not his register. She would learn this and had already suspected it. But carefully, with the same deliberate, load-bearing precision he applied to everything that mattered, his hand still at her face and hers still over his, and the amber evening light coming through the open window with the blackbird's silence after song, and the smell of London in spring, of new leaves and old stone, and the faint, impossible sweetness of 100 confectionery enchantments crystallized into the walls of something being patiently, lovingly restored. She kissed him back with the full and unmanaged attention she gave to things she had stopped pretending she didn't care about. And the teacups sat cooling on the table, and the bakery biscuits sat unconsidered, and the thin stack of completed paperwork held its orderly position in the amber light, and none of it required any further documentation. She found the original form 3 weeks later, not looking for it, or not entirely. She had been reorganizing the desk drawer, the one where she kept things that were not strictly administrative. And it had come to the surface like something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to be found. Magical guardianship decree. Emergency surety provision. Ward. Malfoy. Draco L. Guardian. Granger. Hermione J. She read it this time. All of it. Every subclause, every provision, every requirement she had agreed to without knowing she was agreeing, in a storage room that smelled of copper and old ink at 11:30 on a Thursday, when her candle had burned to a nub and her eyes had been doing the sliding thing. She read the line she had missed. She read the line about weekly contact, documented for the duration of the guardianship. She read the final clause, the one at the very bottom of the last page, the one she had not reached even in her post-disaster reading, the one that began, "It is the ministry's intention in establishing this provision that the relationship between guardian and ward serve not merely as legal surety, but as a foundation for..." She stopped. She read it again. She started laughing. It began as a small, incredulous sound and grew into something genuine and helpless, the kind of laughter that arrives when the universe has arranged something so precisely absurd that the only appropriate response is complete surrender. She sat at her desk with the form in her hands and laughed until her eyes watered. And then she took a photograph of the final clause with her muggle phone and sent it to the address she now had saved under simply D. His reply came in under 2 minutes. I read the full form the day I received it. I've been wondering when you'd find that clause. D. She stared at the message. You knew, she wrote back. I knew, he confirmed. And you didn't tell me. A pause, longer than his usual pauses. She could picture him at the work table in the flat. Their flat now, or nearly, the spare key on her keyring, making a small weight she had grown quietly accustomed to. Looking at his phone with that almost smile committing fully to itself in the amber lamplight. His reply, when it came, was 4 words. You didn't read it. She looked at the form, at the final clause, with its ministry-approved language and its extraordinary, completely deniable implication. At the date at the top, 9 months ago, a Thursday evening, a candle burned to a nub. She put the form back in the drawer. She put on her coat. She went to find him.
I want to tell you something about this story. I didn't want to write another love story where 2 people just fall in love. That felt too easy, because real feeling don't work like that. Real feeling are slow. They hide inside small thing. A cup of tea, a cup of coffee with the right order, a borrowed book wrapped in the paper so it wouldn't get wet, a signature on a form nobody read. Draco and Hermione didn't choose each other, not at first. They were just placed near each other by accident, by paperwork, by a tired woman with a guttering candle. And then something happened, slowly, quietly, without anyone's permissions. That's the part I find most true. You don't always choose the person who changes you. Sometimes they just appear in the wrong moment with the wrong history, and somehow it becomes the right story. I think we all have a form we seen it without reading, a moment we said yes to something before we understood what it was, and sometimes that's exactly how the best things begin. Thank you for listening.